Earlier today, I interviewed journalist Joanne Barkan. She writes a lot of articles about the theme of K-12 education and particularly the role of big philanthropy and private donation money in public education, and also the issue of school choice and school privatization. And she urges against both of those things as what she sees as kind of undemocratic goings on and trends in public education. So we're going to talk about privatization, and we're going to talk about the role of big philanthropy in K-12 and her arguments potentially against these things and why we should be cautious and concerned. So before I show you the interview, let me introduce her real quick. Joanne Barkan is a journalist who, among other things, writes about the privatization of public education and the relationship of, quote, big philanthropy and, quote, democracy and education reforms. Her articles have appeared in a variety of journals, from The Guardian to The Washington Post to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, Jacobin magazine, as well as Dissent magazine, where she's also on the editorial board. So here is our interview, and I hope you enjoy it. I hope it gets you thinking about ideas about big philanthropy and school choice. So, Joanne Barkan, thank you for joining us today. You write a lot about the issues of school choice and kind of the increasing, I guess, zeal some people have for school choice, and you write a lot about big philanthropy and its increasing role in education. So I would really like to get a sense from you to start why, as a journalist, you got interested in these two issues, particularly what made you pay attention to these issues and kind of run with these two issues?
Well, I think I've always felt that public education is a cornerstone, if not the cornerstone, of a strong democracy, that without public education, good public education for everyone, you're really not going to have a thoroughly democratic society. And so, you know, I've been saying that for decades and decades and decades and decades. But what happened is I wasn't really paying attention to what was happening in public education in the United States. I really knew nothing about the education reform movement. So this was in about 2008, 2009. And it was actually during a conversation about Bill Gates and what he was doing in terms of pushing reforms that awakened me to what was going on. So I started just reading, and I was actually horrified by what I found in this education reform movement. And about that time, Diane Ravitch published a book that was called The Death and Life of the Great American School System. I hope I have the title correct. It's more or less that. And I reviewed it for Dissent magazine, and I found the book fascinating and horrifying at the same time. And because I feel so strongly, or I had always felt so strongly about public education, suddenly discovering that it was being undermined, and undermined across the political spectrum, from people who considered themselves liberal Democrats all the way to the far right, I felt that this was something I had to stick with. It's something I had to write about and something that I had to explore. And so going into it that way, just starting with some information about what the Gates Foundation was doing, brought me to critique not only the ed reform movement, but the role of private philanthropy.
So let's start then with private philanthropy and your writings on what you call big philanthropy in K-12 education. So it looks like, if I'm correct, really over the past 12 or so years, there's just been a really large increase in the presence of private foundation money going to public education. So the first question I have is, why do folks like Bill and Melinda Gates, or let's say the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation or the Walton Foundation, why are they getting into, or why are they getting so interested, do you think, in K-12 education? And secondly, why is that something that we should be concerned about? Why is that, I think, as you call it, kind of a threat to democracy?
Well, since the first private foundations appeared in the United States, which was in the first decade of the 20th century, those foundations have been interested in education. They've been interested in education probably because they also realized that it was so important to have an educated population, and also because they saw the huge disparities in education in the United States. And public education was a fairly new thing at that point. So the tie between education and considerations of access to education and also quality of education has been an issue that private foundations have always looked at. But private foundations have changed very, very dramatically in, let's say, the last 20 years. It used to be that private foundations kept a low profile. From the beginning, they were not very popular in the United States. People saw it as a way to, I don't know, shelter wealth or a way to influence public policy in an undemocratic way. So private foundations kept a fairly relatively low profile. So we've sort of gone from what is and still is legally as a tax category, a private foundation, to what I would call a personal foundation. So if you think of something like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they have a board of directors of 3 people, Bill Gates, Melinda Gates, and Warren Buffett. So everything that happens is really under the control of these people. That's very much true for Michael Bloomberg, for the Arnold Foundation, for the Eli and Edith Broad Foundation. These are really personal foundations. And these people are very activist in that they've decided that they know what is best in the field of education, or for the Gates Foundation as well, in the field of international health issues. So what these new foundations do is they fund their own research, which makes it very questionable to begin with, and all of the research that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation produces has been questioned in terms of its authenticity or its accuracy. And generally, the way these foundations function is they publish the research that they want, that they have founded, and then they use that to organize a huge advocacy system for the proposals that they're interested in. They have, in general, this idea that they know best, that it's their money, and so they can do whatever they want with their money, that they have some sort of special magic touch because they became very wealthy, and therefore they somehow have the right to impose their ideas of the common good or of education reform on everyone else.
Let's look at some of your recent work, particularly on charters and school privatization, school choice movements. So particularly in the current political climate, a recent article of yours talked about kind of the Milton Friedman, the economist, and the current Secretary of U.S. Board of Education, Betsy DeVos, and you refer to them as, quote, ideological soulmates, a fact that justifiably panics supporters of public education. So who was Milton Friedman, the economist, and why do you say that the alignment between Betsy DeVos and, let's say, someone like Milton Friedman should kind of terrify supporters of public education?
Well, Milton Friedman, in 1955, well, I should actually just say a word about him. He is generally acknowledged as the patron saint of the free market. He was a very conservative but very ideological economist, very well regarded in many circles. He was a Nobel Prize winner, but he was really ideological in the sense that everything that he wrote about economics was based on his assumptions, which is that all economic activity in any society should be based on a free market, and that the only role of government was to keep the market free. So in 1955, he wrote an essay that was called The Role of Government in Education, a seminal essay. And he presented this thesis, that the government has no interest, or let's call it the state. The state has no interest in education, except that in a democracy and free society, citizens must have a minimum level of education. They must be literate. and they must know enough to function as citizens. And therefore, the way that the government should provide or ensure that minimum is to give a voucher to every parent or guardian for every child for a fixed amount of money, just that amount of money to provide that minimum of education. And then all schools should just be out there in the big marketplace. This idea, let me just say what the major flaw in it is, that it will immediately create an extremely unequal system of education. And why is that? It's because parents who have more money to add to the voucher can add that money to the voucher and buy better education for their children. So very, very wealthy people can spend as much as they need to spend to make sure that there is an elite strata of schools that will be excellent, but that would also help their kids maintain their advantages throughout life. Then you'll have some middle class parents. They'll add as much as they can to the voucher to make sure that their kids can go to the best possible school. And then you'll have parents who have much less income, let's say in, let's call it the lower middle class. And those parents will really have to scrounge around to find schools that they can afford. And they're going to find, you know, the most decent school possible.
I think maybe, I wonder if Milton Friedman would have agreed with this. Okay, so we might create an unequal school system, but I can imagine them saying something like, well, you know, it's supposed to be a rising tide that will lift all boats, right? So maybe it's not as much about equality, it's more about if you put it in the market, the competitive process will potentially rise the quality of education for all, as opposed to let's say a semi-monopolistic public school system. So I'm wondering if that's kind of what he had in mind. So what would your response be to, let's say, an objection like that?
Well, competition in the market creates winners and losers. It doesn't create necessarily a rising tide for everyone. It would create very, very quickly a highly stratified system for just in the process that I described, because some people could spend so much more on their schools and some people would have just this very, very limited amount. So for anyone, let's say, let's even say it's the bottom third of what schools would be available based on what those parents could pay. Those schools are not going to be lifted up by anything. If anything, they're going to be held down because they're going to have fewer resources.
So yeah, now let's then go to Betsy DeVos. So we are taping this in late February 2007, or 2017 rather, and Donald Trump is now the president, and Betsy DeVos has been recently cleared as the secretary of the Board of Education. And you say that she's kind of, I guess, kind of ideological soulmates with Milton Friedman, that this would obviously be a problem for American democracy.
Betsy DeVos, I would say, is probably been, for the last 2 or 3 decades, the primary lobbyist for a voucher system, for exactly the system that Milton Friedman proposed. She also supports charter schools, and charter schools are something different from a voucher system, but it's also a form of privatization.
Maybe we should distinguish between, you mentioned the difference between a voucher system and a charter school system. So the difference, as I understand it, is a charter system is a charter school is a privately run school that technically will get public funds and be technically part of the public system, but it operates in some ways like a private school. You have the authority to kind of create your own rules, and it could be for profit, but students would choose in, and then if there are more students than there are seats, it'll be like a random lottery system or something like that. Whereas a voucher system is really completely private schools that are paid for by money that parents receive as vouchers. So that's kind of the way it seems like they're different. Is that pretty accurate?
Yes, that is quite accurate. It's probably important to emphasize that when a parent decides to send his or her child to a charter school, that child carries the state per child funding out of the public school system and into the charter system, which is privately controlled. So the money follows the student from the public system into the charter system, and the money goes to the school. Whereas with the voucher system, the government money goes directly to the parent or guardian, and then it goes into the private system.
Right. Okay. So then you were going to say a few words about kind of the general, I guess, theme of privatization and how it's potentially related to all this.
Yes. So privatization works in a particular way in the United States. In countries that have large nationalized industries, an example would be Aeroflot in Russia, or the National Health Service in the UK. If you privatize a nationalized or state-owned industry like that, what you're doing is you're selling it to new private owners. Usually it's put on the stock market. In the United States, we don't really have those kinds of key industries that have been nationalized. Privatization works this way. It is taking a public service or a public good and having it provided for or produced in the private sector, but the money comes from the public sector. So the example that people know the best is that federal prisons have been privatized. The money is completely government money, it's completely taxpayer money, but it's a private for-profit, or maybe they can be called, some of them call themselves nonprofit, entity that has complete control over that taxpayer money and runs the entity. So it's the same thing. Privatization of public schools is the same thing. Public money, private control. And it comes in several forms. Now, the key to understanding privatization of public education is that it is always taking public money and channeling it to the private sector. And it can be done in lots of ways. It can be done with a voucher, which we've talked about. It can be done with a charter school, which we've talked about. It can be done with tax credits for parents to use for the tuition in private schools. Or it can be done with tax credits to individuals or to corporations to create scholarships for private schools. Or it can be done with what are called education savings accounts, which are a very peculiar thing from my point of view. It's actually, in most cases, a government-funded debit card that is given to parents or guardians that they can use for all sorts of expenses for private schools. No, not just tuition, but tutoring, anything else. So that is how privatization of public education works. And for those of us who oppose it, we oppose it because it is taking money out of this pool that is supposed to be for the education of every child, no child turned away. And theoretically, it's supposed to provide a good and equal education. And it's just siphoning off that money into private hands. So back to Betsy DeVos, our new Secretary of Education. She is an ardent supporter of school privatization. She herself, I should just add, is an activist, fundamentalist, Christian, and particularly interested in religious education. She has no personal experience at all in public education. She and every member of her family went to Christian schools, and she supports them. We haven't even mentioned the fact that she's also comes from a multi-billionaire family that does a lot of funding and has various foundations and organizations that it funds. And a lot of their funding has gone to religious schools.
What particular types of school choice or mechanisms of school choice, because you've mentioned a few, does Betsy DeVos, or is she on record as supporting? And what are the problems with kind of her support for those programs?
Well, she's on the record as supporting vouchers very heavily, both in terms of what she says and what she funds, but also she and her family, I should just say that her family makes political donations as a group. They have a family association, and they have, a governing structure, and they make these decisions usually together. Not always. They all have separate foundations as well. But in any case, I'm going to be talking about DeVos family money. The DeVoses funded a referendum in the state of Michigan to institute a voucher system. They poured many, many millions of dollars into it, and it failed. So in her own state, and backed by her family money, she really tried to institute vouchers in Michigan. And there's no doubt that she supports vouchers in general. And if the federal government economic policies could be oriented to expand voucher programs, she would be in favor of that. Also, charter schools. She's a very, very strong supporter of charter schools, but the unfortunate twist in her case is that she supports unregulated charter schools. So I will just very, very briefly describe something that happened just last spring. There are many, many charter schools in the city of Detroit. It's very heavily charterized now. But the charters are not well regulated, and many of them are poorly performed. I mean, it's really turned into a public scandal as how bad they were. On top of that, once you've gone to a kind of school choice system that way, and neighborhood schools are closed, you no longer have available seats in schools in a well-distributed way. So there are some places in Detroit, once again, minority and low-income neighborhoods, where there really weren't enough seats and where people didn't have the money to spend on daily transportation across the city. So it got so bad that the governor and charter school organizations, management organizations, and some charter school supporters, and some of the teachers' unions supported what was just going to be a simple oversight committee for Detroit schools, for all of Detroit charter schools. And it was really a very mild kind of oversight committee. And when it went to the Republican Senate, the Senate approved it. And I mean the state legislature, Senate. Then it went to the state house. And then the DeVos money and the other privatizing money began pouring in. And the House voted down the bill that had been approved by the Senate. So then it had to go back to the Senate for some kind of reconciliation. The question became, was the Senate going to gut its own bill? And in fact, the Senate did. Simultaneously to that happening, money began pouring in from the DeVos family. And the argument that Betsy DeVos has made herself is that oversight is simply another level of bureaucracy, that these schools have to be free to operate the way they want to be, the way they want to operate. And it comes, straight from a Milton Friedman type theory that government can only interfere and make things worse. So how do bad charter schools get closed? Well, according to Milton Friedman and according to Betsy DeVos, and she is on record as saying this, they get closed when parents decide to walk away. When the school is so bad that the parents leave, okay, then the school closes. I mean, from my point of view, this is absolutely unacceptable. First of all, it assumes that it's okay for children to stay in failing schools for a year, 2 years, 3 years until they fail. And it also assumes that all parents have the resources and the time to go search and find another adequate school.
So it occurs to me listening to you talk that some people would say something like, okay, but who doesn't want people to have choice? Who doesn't want people to have a range of options to pick from in terms of schools? What is the problem with that? So I wonder what you would say to an objection like that about, okay, so would you rather not have choice or would you rather have choice? It seems like the answer is clear.
So using the word choice and the word choice for parents, school choice, has become extremely popular, and it actually, a majority of Americans approve of it. And it sounds wonderful because you say, why shouldn't a parent have a choice as to where to send his or her child? Or you could say, wealthy parents have choices for where they can send their children. Why shouldn't low-income people have the same kind of choice? But choice is actually a euphemism for privatization. So that sounds like that's very dogmatic and overly strict on my part, but it's true, because if you look at all the choice mechanisms within the public school system, vouchers, charter schools, tax credits of various kind, education savings accounts, every one of them takes public monies and puts it into private hands. And as I said before, that's the way privatization works in the United States. So from my point of view, anyone who's interested in protecting and making better public education in the United States, first of all, has to understand that whenever they hear choice, it means privatization, and that we have to try to make that clear to people.
The last question I was going to ask you about is that it really seems like all of these issues, school choice issues and big philanthropy issues, my reading of the data is that both of these are kind of on the rise. That big philanthropy money seems to be on the rise over the past, let's say even 12 years. And also school choice programs can be on the rise. There's more of them today than there were 12 years ago, similar things like that. So I wonder if you have any ideas on why politicians are so willing to initiate or entertain these programs, both taking big philanthropy money for their programs and projects, and also institute school choice programs that you think would clearly be bad?
Well, the push for privatization began in the 1980s. And it comes out of an ideological position and a political position. The ideological position is just dislike of the public sector and desire to trim down the public sector. And politically, especially in the 1980s, the teachers' unions were extremely strong, and undermining, privatizing public education was also a way of undermining the teachers' unions, not just because they're unions, although there are certainly many conservatives who just dislike unions as unions, but also because the teachers' unions were such a strong support for the Democratic Party and provided a lot of ground troops during elections. So that's when it began in the 1980s. And then you had neoliberal Democrats like Bill Clinton, who liked the idea of marketization. But then in the noughts, after 2000, the right and certain forces in the centrist part of the political spectrum began to push the notion very, very heavily that American public education was failing. That it was failing so badly it was a national emergency. That it was failing so badly it was a national security risk. The national statistics, when you look at the longitudinal statistics, American education coming into this period had never been stronger, not just for middle class and white students, but if you look at the statistics for low income and minority students, the progress that had been made since the civil rights movement was really, really enormous. And yet it served the ideological and political purposes of many, many people. For the reasons I described before, ideological and political, it served their purposes to start screaming like Chicken Little that the sky was falling. And in fact, this education reform movement and this privatization movement really couldn't exist without creating this moral panic. I think that's a word that has been used by writers for this, a moral panic about the state of public schools. So the hue and cry about failing public schools fit into the political strategies, as I said, of conservatives for a lot of reasons. But then there was this whole push among wealthy centrist people that they had to take on the crusade to fix public education for low-income and minority kids. And they became missionaries, based on these theories and models that had no basis in fact.
Well, Ms. Barkan, thank you very much for talking with us today. It'll give our viewers a really good insight into arguments against school choice programs and big philanthropy programs in public education. And thank you very much for spending time with us.
You're very welcome.